It is July 2025. ApexX has been considered tentatively active across a period of nearly 6 years now, but the staggered and stagnant production has only worsened. It is time to reflect upon the project objectively once again. Its current state, the work done earlier in this year, potential future work, and if the project will see any work at all. I am no stranger to long and difficult periods of life, nor am I a stranger to difficult production life. ApexX, however, has the exceptional misfortune of sharing the time period with the worst days of my life. Extreme stress, loss, homelessness, financial devastation, and overall exhaustion have made easy challenges difficult and difficult challenges impossible. Throughout the project's life, I have released the rare demonstration video to the public, overviewing some of the work in the time period between the last demonstrations. Privately, I released dozens of videos spanning 5 seasons, from its days as the last of my StarCraft II R&D prototypes to the last of the Red Pill Rundown series created in 2024, and finally, major discussion videos built earlier in this year. This video would have been similar, but what I have worked on in this year is not particularly demonstrable yet. However, I have chosen to demonstrate it in its current state as a proof of concept and a discussion set piece. To get into that discussion, though, some groundwork needs to be laid for it. I am a dumbass, and my vocabulary is very weak, so approaching this discussion in a concise manner is not really possible. The short of it is that I don't know what to do. But the long of it is the interlocking and nebulous components of why this conclusion was made. An easy one is the fact I am not an artist, so the character asset problem will never be solved, and my efforts into it thus far have all been for building a placeholder I'll never be content with. Having worked with 3D graphics since 2001, this is not a particularly encouraging compromise to make. With the problems of the project I have alluded to elsewhere in previous demo videos, and discussed for nearly 100 hours privately, are substantially more complex to get into. This discussion will cut to the heart of some of the psychological problems behind the project and my time with it. I have, in the last decade, tasked the challenge of motivation to a simple query. What do I want to do? And when discussing matters of development with others interested in the subject, I point them to this same question. It's a simple question, but a powerful and difficult one. The gut instinct is almost always wrong. The veil of the ARPG-driven review and analysis arc that led me through much of my LP projects, coupled with the living world concept and other development work I either built or wrote out in the 2000s, doesn't necessarily describe what I had ultimately envisioned ApexX to be about. It's visualized as a form of an action game that has never before been attempted by anyone. But because it breaks away from trends such as linear corridors or multiplayer-driven PvP, it has to invent its own mechanisms to drive player engagement forward. At the time of this recording, the combat engine is fairly functional and represents a very strong pillar in this direction. But the combat engine is the easy part, and zone design, referred to as overworld progression, is the complex one. The living world concept originates from my Warcraft 3 campaigns, which effectively replaced all forms of pre-placed units, auto-spawned waves, and other conventional behavior of RTS or RPG single-player content with actual RTS gameplay, a concept that is entirely unheard of even in modern games calling themselves a part of this genre. The idea that the world doesn't remain static and only react to you statically, it's alive and things happen with or without your involvement, like a real game. Hence, living world. But this doesn't necessarily give the player a meaningful objective to pursue, or a meaningful reason to interact with that game world. In these projects, which were still isometric, build and destroy was always an acceptable design because that was the nature of the genre. In a third-person project, this gets substantially more muddy, especially when you want to keep the player as a single unit. When I first publicated material for ApexX, I laid out my initial design mantra for the project: no experience system, no currency systems, and reliance on skill expression as your form of general progression. Something I didn't get much into was that I had always intended for zones to be solvable. This wasn't necessarily to encourage speedrunning, but to encourage consistency. What units that would spawn on the map, such as the spawners for the Voidhounds and Phase 2 of Arbiter, and what objectives you need to fill and their conditions, the crow statues, for example, these would always be in the same place, and any related material would be similarly static. The templates, or the foundations, of what would become the player-facing objectives and progression paths through a zone would always be static to remove randomness as much as possible. But this never quite fit the living world concept, because macro-scale activities would never be solvable. The outcome of any given NPC versus NPC battle could change the outcome of base layouts, paths that units take, what units are alive or dead, so on. The only way to avoid this is to not use a living world, and not have macro-scale elements like base building, resource gathering, scouting, and inter-AI communication. I had accepted I would have this polarity between the elements, and defer to the objectives themselves as solvable, and leave the AI and related components as living. After all, a static dead world with dead AI would simply be the exact same project every other action game ever made. I came here to break this very convention first and foremost. This is just one component of the design in my head I hadn't completed, but felt confident that I could. I set it aside in favor of more immediate development objectives. The first has always been the player character. Not just the asset it uses, but the controls, the movesets, the combat engine, and so on. Learning programmatic concepts, applying them, improving old work, feeling out what felt good to me as a player in the limited scope of my content, so on. ApexX had a playable foundation with a combat engine, Z-level navigating AI that could jump over gaps and use ranged attacks, and example cascade particle effects a month into its lifespan. Since then, an amount of content has been added, but the technical cost of development, especially pursuing research for graphics assets for the player character, took priority over actual content. I entered a similar and very straining situation I had with heavily hard-coded games like StarCraft 2 or Age of Wonders 2 for very different reasons, and it took me some years yet to figure out why it was always so demotivating to be in such a position, even though now, for the first time in my life, I had the power and tools to overcome most of the problems set before me, and I eventually would for nearly everything except the character assets. I'm shortcutting a lot of discussion topics and other avenues of observation to reach this point first, because I feel like it's more important than I've ever thought it to be. I am a run-and-gun developer. I don't write out game documents or plans. I run and gun. I always come into a project with a strong mental visualization, sometimes years old, of how things should look, sound, and feel. Historically, my problems have always come up that games don't support my visions. StarCraft 2's AI, for example, follows a very long road of similar limitations, but the game's poor excuse of data management and terribly performing editor killed my motivation as well. I built tons of experimental maps and assets, and dabbled for years with the AI, but I never reached real content production because there was never the foundation to do so. Conversely, but projects like Lowlands of Legend 2042 saw tons of content created before I realized the limitations of the AI and everything related. The difference in the way the projects were built is determined by my comfort and how I reached it. Age of Wonders 2 is very easy to put content into, so replacing the 16 races with new sounds and graphics was mostly a matter of me either acquiring the assets from third parties or, as I reached the end of the project's life, building and mastering my own porting and rendering pipelines to make my own. Seeing my dreams come to life gives me drive. I came into that project with pre-existing skills, and those skills were enough to make me comfortable and eventually complacent. Exposing the game's terrible AI issues and the subsequent brick wall of the AI being totally hard-coded took time. Experiences like this hardened me and evolved my approach to development. All of my efforts learning 3ds Max pipelines, porting assets from games and putting them into Age of Wonders 2 was wasted. Many other projects were already behind me, all with similar stories, and by the time I reached StarCraft 2, I was very wary about investing that work into a project before I knew it was possible. Contrasting my run-and-gun methodology is an extreme persistence and stubbornness. StarCraft 2 resisted me every step of the way, and I felt I could break it and bend it to my will as I had Brood War and others, but it simply wasn't possible. The problems were far too numerous and too severe. The performance was unacceptable both in-game and in editor, and nearly 10 years of time with every mind available concluded time and time again with it being impossible to salvage, even at a level within the shadow of Brood War. I wasted the last years of peace in my life with StarCraft 2 and Sins of a Solar Empire, all for projects that would live and die in total solitude and darkness. After 2014, things became terribly dark and bloody in my world, and the decades of hell began. Hardship only reinforced my stubbornness, my belief I could conquer a path forward to bringing my dreams to life. One thing that never changed is I always had a strong vision of what I wanted. Even as I downscaled projects time and time again, I always had a vision. ApexX was not born of a similar fire. It was born of a perilous time, an ignition of ancient and old ideas and dreams I hadn't ever deemed reasonable for me to attempt to make. I had no faith in my ability to learn programming. After all, I couldn't learn graphics, which was seen as the easier of the two by far. Graphics I had wrestled with since the 90s. I never gave much thought to programming or programmatic concepts. I never really needed it until now. The same force that carried extensive content development in Age of Wonders 2 and the coasting of incomplete ideologies and designs in ApexX is complacency. It's a matter of compartmentalizing my time and energy because 99% of my development is solo. Rarely I have HKS to help me with some things, like engine work in Unreal, or some of the graphical stuff in Age of Wonders 2, but the bulk of the work is mine, and the vision is mine. Managing projects, large or small, requires one to divide their work into manageable pieces. I don't worry about certain things like how missions will be laid out, or how the story will look, or what the characters will be present, because conjuring these things has always been second nature. But within this very equation was a hidden nemesis that grew strong within the waters of complacency. Its colors and nature have changed from nearly 20 years ago when I worked on Luldens of Legend, but it spells perils of a similar scale. Running and gunning is prone to mistakes. Mistakes are important. You learn from mistakes. If something goes off without a hitch, then I become deeply concerned. I'm not proficient in these tools. Chances are something did go wrong somewhere, and I don't realize it. For example, the current blueprints for the player character in ApexX have weird and obscure bugs in them I can probably fix with a major revision to state management. But I don't know how exactly those bugs actually manifested, and it took over a year of development after it launched for me to reach a stage where bugs began to manifest in such a manner. The growth was not without its costs, both obvious and not so. That's the nature of learning. You return to old work and revise it to fix things. However, some mistakes are not so obvious, as they aren't technical in nature. They may not even really be mistakes. They're the products of complacency. Conscious or subconscious ignorance of what might be favorably construed as complications, or in the worst case scenarios, project-killing oversights. In the case of Lowlands of Legend, it was the fact that AI in Age of Wonders 2 can't play the overworld. It can't close games, and it's extremely inefficient, slow, and has no sense of awareness of the map content. Once your game reached 100 or so turns, they became an utter slog. There was also the hard code related to structures and the damage systems and so on. You couldn't add any, so trying to make tech trees to divide the 10 tiers of units simply wasn't possible, producing major balancing problems, again only obvious in late game scenarios. Producing content for the project and testing it short term was easy. Exposing the late game clusterfucks took time. I didn't read the trickle before the landslide of revelations was upon me. For Warcraft 3, I always knew the AI was terrible, but it took building certain kinds of maps to expose it in full. For example, maps larger than 64 by 64, where their hard-coded behavior to reset attack waves, often ignoring being attacked along the way, after killing a single target, designated by the captain unit, made gameplay an utter joke rather than just odd, if they could navigate the map at all. These two examples are technical problems, ones you can address and solve in Unreal Engine, so the way I look at these things is oh so different. I have never been concerned if I wasn't sure how to address a certain technical challenge in the engine. It's been enough to know a solution likely does exist. For the character asset, this was an unsolvable challenge. I'm not an artist, I never will be, not even with another 30 years. And no third-party content exists that would suffice. Nothing can be ported, ripped, or bought. So a lot of time and energy and thought process was invested into this subject. I set aside considerations and potential challenges in my thoughts and focused on this one thing, as I perceived it to be the ultimate challenge to the project, and thus the ultimate threat. It might still be, but this is a form of complacency. By compartmentalizing my thoughts in such a way, I didn't realize I didn't actually have even the hint of a proposal on what the other half of the player-facing game might be like. I knew I wanted action combat and the living world. But this isn't how you populate levels, it's not what gives the player an incentive to engage them. The realization that solvable levels, respawning and redoing content, e.g. Dark Souls, was counterintuitive and could not synergize with the high intensity and high lethality living world concept even at a small level, was only the tip of the iceberg of this realization. But the first voyage was instrumental in exposing that tip, and it has taken over 3 years to deeply contemplate that and future experiences, returning to the drawing board broadly, and realize I actually have no idea what I even want to do. My stubbornness and refusal to give up on ApexX has taken me through the trials of defiance, acceptance, and misery of conceding defeat to the player character, and helped me realize the original action concept visualized for ApexX was only half complete, and I can't actually ignore the second half of the equation. No longer can I run and gun. This is why there has been so little content built for the project since 2022, and why so many demos since then have focused so heavily on technicalities. My learning process and refinement of the existing content has continued, but I've reverted once more to that R&D mindset rather than building things for a project I don't even know we'll see another meaningful update, because I don't know what a meaningful update would look like. Complacency is a mind killer. As you develop skills and techniques, approaching certain tasks or challenges can be comfortable. Once that comfort becomes second nature and the routine becomes ingrained, you will eventually become complacent. Complacency is akin to a second nature, but it also becomes stiff and rigid, and will actively resist and refute exterior influences. This means that complacent thought paths have difficulty growing, evolving, and adapting. It also means they'll become extremely resistant to critique and reform, especially from within. You might know something you do is inefficient, wasteful, or costly, or prompting problems in the future, but you've done it this way for so long you'd rather be comfortable than not. This is complacency, not comfort. Complacency acts as a shroud that casts a shadow in which undiscovered threats to project development can flourish. Complacency has a strong affinity with stubbornness. In being stubborn, for example, in believing I can solve or force my way through certain challenges, I become complacent in believing overcoming those challenges will give me the motivation to take on others. This might be true, and sometimes it can be, but as I am a run-and-gun developer, there's not much running in using complacency and stubbornness to bash my head into impossible challenges. I recognize this problem often in my youth, and it's why I abandoned so many projects like those in Warcraft 3. I recognized I can't reverse engineer and fix hard-coded problems. What I wanted to do simply wasn't possible. The firm guidelines of modding gave me very binary resolutions to such things. Arm myself with knowledge, discover limitations, make the cut. StarCraft 2 brought me untold suffering because I refused to accept I couldn't figure things out. The information was always there. Along the way, some individuals like Jade Mistrug gave me delusions of hope with no substance, but enough temptation I accepted those rather than take on actually important challenges like actual game development. I was afraid and intimidated and too comfort in this arena even though I wasn't seeing success. I was complacent. I only begun the road to game development on the eve of the most disastrous 6 years of my life yet. It's not like I can be truly disappointed in what has transpired since then in terms of ApexX's progress. It's a wonder I am still alive at all. Yet, this has only opened the road to further complacency. I have never expected ApexX to be a project I can bring to any demonstrable fruition. I never thought long-term. I had a bucket list of observations from my analytical casts. I had my ambitions from the MGEC and Living World. I had a visualization in my head of the player character. I let the heat and furor of life's hellish crucible immerse me in my last stand for my 30 years as a creator. Failure was the expectation. I didn't fail. Character asset issues aside, I knocked down challenge after challenge in ApexX. The fact I had such a demonstrable project so soon was encouraging to my run-and-gun development ethos, but it was also something that should have concerned me. I truly didn't know what to do next, where to go next. Building up to the first voyage and the Arbiter demo saw me instinctively feel like I was being stretched somewhat thin. This was a veil of complacency starting to form, a willful neglect. How many years have passed, and while life has taken a terrible downturn, I'm still alive, and the project has barely been touched in the last 3 years. Not for the lack of time, but for the lack of drive, motivation, and vision. Indeed, the subject of this discussion is that the very vision for the project, and my time as a game developer, has been long lost. I feel as though I've passed through a wild forest, entered a clearing, and am now scratching my head, wondering how I ended up here and why, and furthermore, what path is best to take from here on. This indecision is the ultimate final death throes of my creative process. It's a sign that I've lost all hope and all purpose for pursuing development. It's a sign that the flame that once burned as bright as the sun and kept me alive all these years has almost entirely been extinguished. Running and gunning is not linear. There's often backtracking involved, and sometimes you gun yourself down a few times in the process. What's important is momentum. I thrive upon momentum, physically and mentally. Molehills easily become mountains in my world. A single shred of doubt is weeks of panic attacks. A mere slight becomes an obsession. A complication becomes a Herculean vortex of madness. I am mentally unstable at the best of times. The only way I can function is by distracting myself with momentum. The more momentum I have, the more I can overcome by ignoring or bull rushing. Trying to determine how to shape, improve, and weaponize momentum has been a long research for me. You've seen it even within the scope of the demo content for ApexX. The structure and form of the content discussed in each production is all the result of fleeting momentum harnessed for a spout of spurious action that soon burns out as quickly as it had begun. In a month's time, I can push out tremendous amounts of labor. It can begin at the tip of a hat. But what this also can cost me is enormous heartache. Black Sun Retribution, a machinima project, was launched in 2012 when a third party said they'd help me with character assets. The project was abandoned in early 2014 with nearly 80% of its content completed, because this third party decided to ghost me, rather than admit he apparently simply lost interest. It was the last time I would ever wake up feeling energized for a day and ready to work. And work I did. Endless building and modeling and researching and testing. I don't enjoy building things. I enjoy seeing them live. The contrast is important. It's cyclical. Long and difficult hardship must be met with exceptional and triumphant results. Nothing kills me more than wasted efforts. Facing failure after failure for any given reason corroded my ability to form momentum. The ingredients necessary became more and more demanding. No longer could I simply have a good vision and some spark of means to make it transiently visible. But ApexX didn't even have a true vision. It had ambition. Ambition that would give rise to reason, contemplation, and deep discord in my lifetime of content creation. I had faith in my ability to put things together and figure out solutions as I reached them, as I always have in design topics throughout my entire life. I always felt that if I could conquer technical problems like art requirements, I could handle the rest just as I had elsewhere. This was complacency that may have been deserved were life fortunate and stable. Soon after 2019, the project lost all momentum, and I focused on this first and foremost. Truly, it was dead from the start. I have struggled for some time with a manner in which to identify myself to myself. Am I a creator, or am I a fool? Were I a creator, would I not have completed the things I set out to create? Would I not have learned the skills necessary to build what I want to build? Why would I permit frivolous things like learning disabilities, whatever mental problems you wish to label, and depression to destroy my life's work? How many projects have I left behind me in my 35 years as a creator? Yes, since my earliest childhood, I built things. I wrote things, I recorded things, I dreamed, and I worked to make those dreams real in whatever manner possible. It is escapism. I seek to escape within my head. I am the ultimate failure of a human being that is possible to become. I produce absolutely nothing of any value whatsoever for other people, and I never intended to do so. I am a private individual, and nearly everything I have built, especially after 2006, has been private and will remain so, no matter its stage of completion. Had I strong means to complete ApexX, it would remain private as well. People and I do not get along. We cannot coexist. I am loveless, and people cannot love me. What I loved died in 2020 and 2021. The emptiness I feel in the wake of these horrible events cannot be filled with ambition or contemplation. This brings us to the second facet of the project's current conundrum: the death of spirit. Were I once a creator, I'm not anymore. I'm broken. I have attempted several times to reset my brain somewhat, distance myself from content development and all things related. One might rightly assume the problems with foresight, planning, and general fatigue, or as a result of burnout. But you have to keep in mind, I've been working on ApexX an average of 3 to 5 weeks a year for the last 3 years, and the periods in the prior years were not much more than this. There is not much opportunity for physical burnout within the project, but there is most certainly room for mental burnout. The mind can be stretched thin and destroyed by stress and hardship. Everything suffers as a result, regardless if it's related or not. There should be a simple solution to determining what I want you to be doing within this project as a player. That solution is determining what I myself enjoy. After all, you should build something that you enjoy as a player, should you not? Over the last year and a half, I've taken time to reflect upon and reintroduce myself to everything I once thought highly of as a gaming experience in my past life for nearly any reason. But this rediscovery process only embittered me further for reasons too numerous to recount in such a discussion. To summarize, all it did was make me realize why I left such products behind and never returned to them again. The combat system in the AI, rather the lack thereof in Heroes of Might and Magic, for example, the most regaled of mods for these games, don't do anything for this experience either. I also reflected upon my past projects and asked myself what drew me to create them to begin with. Was there something in the old visions I could apply to my current ambitions? An undiscovered flame in the ruins of the past? Here I found nothing yet again. I couldn't understand why it is I did the things I used to do. I couldn't understand where that passion once came from. I can no longer connect with who I once was. Indeed, I am an entirely different person now. We are shaped by our experiences. My experiences have made me an entirely new person. A worse person in every respect. Life is difficult, so you've heard. So I've written many times. Tomorrow is not promised to us. Today is a curse, a condemnation, not a blessing. and yesterday is something to regret and lament and loathe. We may make the most of what we can. For me, making it through the day is trial enough. I am posing to you an answer that should be quite evident. Yes, back then, I didn't consider such things as I did today. The simpler life, the simpler visions, the simpler approaches and mental processes, unburdened, unshackled, doubtless, and foolish indeed. The scope of the task did not matter. I tried. Music composition, graphics, sound, all but programming. But the framework of those attempts was bound so by the spurious ventures in products as mere mods. Broodwarp projects were always total conversions. The Age of Wonders 2 project was always going to be a turn-based strategy. Our time in Unreal Tournament was changing gun behaviors within the scope of Unreal Tournament bot matches. Campaigns were RTS ventures in the framework of StarCraft. Being bound by such rules composed the vision in those frameworks. Ambitious as they were for what they were, their scope was nonetheless juvenile compared to something like ApexX. Modding does not prepare you for game design, especially when you're not making a clone of something. I prepared myself with decades of knowledge on the third-person action genre, but that knowledge is similarly castrated in scope. I derive little joy from the way other people do things. That knowledge doesn't tell me what I would enjoy. And now that I'm here, however, asking what I would enjoy, I've become so cold and hardened to all the things in this world that I find I enjoy nearly nothing at all. Nearly nothing. But there is some things I still derive amusement from. Can those things be harnessed for this discussion? This is the root of this entire video production. To present those things to you and my thoughts surrounding them, and the basis from which I arrived to reach these observations. They aren't conclusive, but they're all I have. I have always thought of competitive expression as tapping into a polarizing psychological duel. Player versus player, a test of wits, skill, and adaptability. Action games, such as ApexX, might be called any number of things. Beat-em-ups, hack-and-slash, ARPGs, so on. But much of it comes from fighting games. The essence of a combat engine is ultimately mutating the fighting game paradigms. Every ARPG I have ever played has been small scale, and ultimately just that. A mutation of a fighting game laden with gimmicks. From Dark Souls to God of War, none of these games have ever attempted to branch out of the turn-based unit versus unit trading and countering engagements. Those that make conventional games like Dark Souls with archaic lock-on systems completely fall apart. The most demonstrable representation of this large-scale potential in demo publications is Arbiter's Phase 2, when the first portion of the map fills with summoning structures and soon night dwellers in increasing intensity. The objective for the player here is just to destroy the summoner, a tower that spawns underground, and move back across the map. But taking the time to engage the spawning units quickly hurls you into a frantic and pitched battle that can last over 10 minutes. This high-intensity battle is filled with lethality and requires you to make the most of the movesets available to you, even in less functional aspects like the air dashing. I didn't have a way to describe the feeling of anxiety and intrigue this gave me, so I merely regarded it as promising to me and proved to me my combat design and living world system could function. But I hated the way that this system was posed to you as is. Fighting the units here was meaningless. It's actually a waste of time. But if I was to push incentive onto fighting the units, I either create a mandatory grind, or I need to introduce a currency system to make them, player-driven engagement. The currency system couldn't be tied to experience or level ups, and I was hard set against things like skills or talent trees or unlocks as well. So I left the observations as is. Overture's Phase 2 was regarded positively by all who were familiar with it. The shift in pace and tone, altering an established location, and bringing in new threats and increasing the danger. To conclude, Phase 2 of Arbiter, and intentionally engaging the clusterfuck to come from it, was starting to bridge into a new kind of competitive expression I hadn't thought much of until now. That's because that expression is never found within third-person action games, particularly single-player ones. I don't even necessarily have a way to concisely label it, but I've come to call it chaos control within my design casts. Think Sonic the Hedgehog, but less stinky feet and vor, and more ultra-high skill ceiling in the form of survival testing. Yes, it isn't enough to survive, but dominate and conquer, navigating complex areas filled with many moving parts you don't necessarily have control over, but must adapt to, all constantly changing and evolving. Just like a game of Brood War, but with multiple players. But I didn't understand this element quite yet. I discussed some adjacent metrics like grinding in BDO and competitive pursuits of PvE efficiency, but I never quite had a cohesive shape to reflect upon to give shape to this expression. It would take some time until I was exposed to a new game that allowed me to approach this subject from a different angle, and rediscover fragments both past and present of something I had never quite been able to describe. And ultimately would lead to me abandoning the notion of solvable map designs and objectives entirely. I have already discussed my experiences with Naraka to some extent within multiple past videos, most notably the open world aspect and its crossover with the so-called MMO philosophies in player-driven explorative competition. With this particular context, I want to focus exclusively on a single group of interactions, and specifically the skill set exercised in navigating multi-unit engagements, particularly those involving environmental hazards, such as the zone in late-game damage stages and/or team fighting. It is important to keep in mind my recounts of these things doesn't necessarily mean I intend to replicate them, and my efforts thus far to reflect upon, construct theories for, and otherwise compose documentation on such subjects does not mean I ever intend to make a multiplayer project, replicate the battle royale, or otherwise copy what Naraka does in any form, even though doing so wouldn't necessarily be that difficult. Naraka is a very flawed game, with fundamentally frustrating components laden throughout it, not just the technical incompetencies, but also class imbalances and RNG balance. But this is the perfect point to start with first, before we get too deep into the subject matter itself. The drawing of a line between what constitutes as RNG and frustration, and what constitutes as dynamic, alive, and meaningful obstruction, complication, or depth. The original intent of composing zones in a solvable manner was to remove RNG. Frustration comes as a result of elements that are outside of your control. By making a subject solvable, you encourage competition to solve the subjects efficiently. Solvability doesn't directly correlate to difficulty. Brood War is technically solvable in nearly every respect, sans those influenced by aforementioned RNG. Every matchup and action can be mathematically resolved and has an ideal response. The difference between, for example, a high-level Brood War match and an equivalent in Dark Souls is the skill requirements and feasibility of attaining perfection. Even rudimentary players can make a joke out of the Souls products with a bit of practice. Closest to perfection achievable in Brood War still has flaws and is ultimately limited by the human body and is still susceptible to psychology. My goal has always been to replicate the kind of skill ceiling Brood War has. Not necessarily by replicating technical limitations, but by replicating the room for psychological interaction. I cut to the heart of what makes the essence of Brood War function. Just because all of the actions in Brood War are solvable doesn't mean every player versus player interaction can be solved, because the players individually have so many different elements they can interact with that the so-called chaos control of prioritizing actions and reactions becomes the de facto physical extension of the player's mental body, functioning as a combatant in a dynamic battle. What each player's strengths and weaknesses are, and how they manifest in this complex series of simultaneous interacting bodies, also further defines and identifies a matchup. Anything that pulls away from these interactions, automates or resolves them without mandating players' skill to do so, waters down and destroys the resulting dynamics, and thus the players' ability to express themselves and engage one another meaningfully. The less they control, the less of a game they are playing, and the less meaning it has competitively. It is an important distinction to note that my definition of a competitive medium is one that allows skill expression and interaction. A broad contrast to the solvable design is something akin to Mahjong. Mahjong is played competitively, but it is entirely random, and very little control over the founding elements are available to you. Avid believers of this design have tried to describe the product to me as a game of life. Wine aunts and Chinese grandmothers enjoy Mahjong as a means to abuse and frustrate the young and docile in a complex and gameable framework that mandates a little technical skill and yet also mandates an exceptional learning curve. Mahjong is in some respects brushing shoulders with chaos control. But the distinction between my vision of mutating the solved fighting game dynamic to introduce a game of life, while simultaneously reducing as much player-facing randomness as possible, can be interpreted as where I draw the issue in terms of RNG-driven products, like Mahjong, and also card games. Card games like Shadowverse are what I interpret as the ultimate surrender of skill expression. Deck building as a concept can be interesting, but ultimately the winner is who draws the cards they need when they need them. Powerful decks still lose to weak decks exclusively on chance. The player facing randomness is the tools the player is offered to interact with. Now, how you can interact is random as well. What tools you can interact with are random. Whether you win or lose is thus random. This is before we even consider the opponents and their race or deck, which are also random thanks to matchmaking-driven PvP. We never even consider those because the game is already randomly arbitrated before we even get to that point. Frankly, card games barely even constitute as a game in my eyes. They are the least competitive medium. In contrast, Brood War's attribution to randomness comes down to player psychology, which may be de facto random given the perspective, but it is also ultimately solvable. When solved, however, a player's psychology can change. A player can recognize they have been solved. Doing so isn't easy, and breaking the conditioning is even harder. But this is a test of psychology and the essence of player versus player, the very roots of what it means to be competitive. The solvability of PvP can be unwoven. This isn't the case for PvE, not in any game, especially not for commercial products. I've already broken this trend somewhat in my various RTS projects with custom AI, as mundane as it was, establishing the idea that aggression and shifting playstyles is more effective at PvE competition than so-called smart AI that only tries to build counters. After all, players have a tendency, and an AI that reflects this nature will feel more alive even if nothing else changes. Of course, such systems are also planned for ApexX and are quite trivial to create, but these are all comparatively minor components of what I roll into the combat systems aspect. If a zone containing a group of units or players has an objective that only some units require, they'll do all they can to avoid the rest of the irrelevant aspects of the game and only focus on the objective. If you force them to remove the other units before interacting with the objective, then that interaction becomes a chore. If you incentivize interaction via things like experience gains, then it becomes a grind. Even considering introducing leveling up or skill unlocks is lethal to the competitive environment as it is. This is partly why the Battle Royale interested me somewhat when I was introduced to Naraka. The objective is merely to kill the other units, and all sub-objectives are merely means to incentivize fighting by giving advantages. Of course, those advantages are snowball mechanisms, and that isn't particularly good either, but it does solve one problem I haven't seen in any other game in any other genre solve. Melding exploration and discovery with combat. I don't just want to create an arena. Every other ARPG and third-person action game like Dark Souls is just a series of arenas connected to each other by a linear corridor. However, exploration-based games, or games that feature so-called open worlds, are all unanimously dead and have no content. Procedurally generated content, for example Skyrim Job, is by design an evolutionary dead end and has no redeeming qualities. Randomly distributed content, for example Dwarf Fortress, Rim Job World, and so on, is something I'd never given any thought to because I was aiming for solvable zones. The Battle Royale introduced me to a blend of randomly distributed content and player-driven progression, mixed with a melding of exploration and combat. Specifically Naraka, which uses fighting game mechanics, showed me an important window into what such an environment in ApexX might entail, right to keep on my current path but change how objectives were done. The problem with Naraka is that while it can feature large-scale fighting, most of it isn't at large scale. So the high point of the experience, the so-called chaos control, is not the focus of the game, but when it does come up, it tests a skill set that isn't otherwise seen in any of the games. It's one critical key to the puzzle of unlocking a direction for ApexX, but how I'd make it is not entirely known. I've always felt that Phase 2 Arbiter was the high point of ApexX, but making all of the experiences replicate the experience properly while keeping the thousands of hours of content continually fresh and chore-free is a very long leap from this observation. It means that the player's objectives can't be static. Whether by dying and repeating content or by progression, an effort must be made to ensure each zone or attempt on a zone stands apart from one another. This is why every single person I've ever talked to hates Dark Souls and Souls-like games. Amongst the first complaints I ever hear is this save point system, and how pointless it is to have to redo content that doesn't give you anything, or in most cases, skip past it. Unless you're grinding, there's no reason or need to interact with nearly any of the world elements in a Souls game. It's only authentic and genuine discovery in the very first run-through of the very first play session. Everything after this lacks meaning until the invasion system, in all of its lackadaisical and comedic glory, comes into play, if it ever does. Multiplayer was entirely dead in the runs I did online. Of course, replicating the invasion system in a single-player environment isn't that hard either. Refer to my opposing forces system. But it still doesn't give the player an objective worth pursuing. Destroying enemy bases like an RTS doesn't function as well here either. Or would it? A mindset that has been meticulously sculpted over 35 years needs to be broken down and erased. The roots of complacency can run deep before their damage is recognizable, should you ever recognize them to begin with. It isn't simply a question of what I enjoy and how the application of the interaction that drives that enjoyment might be applied to my work. It's a question of if I understand what brings me enjoyment to begin with. All sentient creatures are driven by survival. Life is a competition. We are wired to reward ourselves with chemical reactions to reinforce actions that drive success in competition. Complacency is akin to a drift between drunken stupor and withdrawal. The former is success and foundation, and the latter is stagnation. I've come to believe a part of my problem is that I've never quite left the mire of being successful and seeing success far enough to enter withdrawal and find a means to test myself again. I've also become fearful of testing myself because I have no faith in my ability to grow, a doubt that has been shaped by experience. As I've aged, I've not simply become set in my ways, I've also become innately resistant to the very belief that I am capable of doing anything different. I don't have a blueprint to follow, and the manner in which my peers conduct their projects is incomprehensible to me. By the time I had acknowledged complacency had poisoned my mind, I was already deep into a form of stagnation that was difficult to quantify as something I could even attempt to address. To this day, I'm not sure it can be addressed at all. The barrier between here and there is a part of my mental disabilities. What these disabilities actually are, be they ADHD, autism, or simply Canadian genetics, really doesn't matter in the end. It can't be remedied or fixed, so it has to be forced down. My strategy to do so has been to continually plunge my erect dick into the ice flats and search for bites under the surface. Surely there's some juicy fish with appropriately stimulating teeth that can give me the satisfaction to ignite the spark of ambition once again. Surely. But this is in itself a complacency. The process of seeking inspiration and motivation is in itself poisoned and complacent. It should be evident after 15 years of trying that there's no fish in this pond. I have to make my own fish. I can't hope revelation will happen upon me, or vice versa. I effectively have to forge my own miracles. People can do this. Normal people can overcome such challenges and move on. I've seen it many times. So far, I haven't been able to myself. That's likely because I have to regress to how I was when I first began. But if we're shaped by our experiences, is such a thing even possible? When I look at something like Naraka, what is it that drives me forward to play this game for now over 1,000 hours in spite of its problems and everything related? What exactly keeps me going? What is really enjoyment? Is it something I can even really describe, much less describe in a manner that can be actuated into a project element, something I can replicate? Or is it simply some medium, some meta interaction that doesn't have a description, that transcends the written word? Perhaps. The only thing that is truly for certain is that ApexX, as it currently is dead, and has been so for quite some time now. If there is to ever be a path forward, I have to find the answer to these questions. I have to be able to resolve the two major challenges of the project, the character assets and the overworld design. Or I have to conjure something entirely new. I have had many ideas over my life. I have struggled time and time again to bring those ideas to life. And now, at the twilight of life, when I have more assets and more ability than I could have ever have dreamed of 20 years ago, I find I no longer have the drive to continue to push forward to anything at all. Life has effectively won, and I have lost. What is to come from now, I cannot say for certain. But I can say it will likely not entirely resemble what just came before. Because if it would simply follow the same path once again. Whether it be complacency, whether it be stubbornness, or whether it be something I entirely don't understand. Whatever it is a great enemy that has wasted almost my entire life chasing that which does not desire to exist.